additional investment, which I think was motivated by the infrastructure bill, by the science and chips bill, and the IRA. When was the last time we had $650 billion in 1 year of additional private sector investment?
I honestly can't think of a time when we've had such a response. It's been absolutely dramatic, and I think it's been driven by the trifecta of legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and especially the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most dramatic, important piece of environmental legislation in history, and we're seeing an unprecedented response.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I would tell all the members of this committee, in 2010, I came up with an agenda that I called Make It in America. There were a lot of talk about Made in America. I said, Made in America is what we did yesterday. Make It in America is what we do today and what we're going to do tomorrow. I think the most Make It in America Congress in which I have served since 1981 was the 117th Congress. And I think the results, not only in terms of investment, but the results in terms of jobs and economic growth that we have seen. I heard the chairman's comments, but I frankly think that an honest analysis of what has happened over the last 36 months, from the pandemic on, we made extraordinary investments, we spent a lot of money, and we have to deal with that because we spent a lot of money, we incurred a lot of debt. But it has made an extraordinary difference in the lives of America and indeed the rest of the world. So that's not a question, it is an observation, but I think important to make. And I yield back.
Mr. Molinar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thanks for being with us today. In your testimony, you mentioned emerging threats, but you didn't, to my understanding, mention China, and nor did you mention ensuring that tax credits provided by the Inflation Reduction Act wouldn't flow to subsidiaries beholden to CCP-affiliated companies. I'm particularly concerned that some tax credits, like the 45X production credit, are essentially refundable, meaning the Treasury will be sending a check to the subsidiaries of Chinese companies for the value of those tax credits. Secretary Yellen, do you believe that tax dollars of hardworking Americans should be given to CCP-affiliated companies or their U.S. subsidiaries? In the interest of time, just yes or no would be helpful.
Well, really, it is our job at Treasury to implement the law that has been passed by Congress, and we're doing our best to do that. The 45X production credit, advanced production credit, is intended to onshore important energy supply chains, and it can only go when there is significant production of the components indicated in the legislation has to occur in the United States. But the legislation does not preclude Chinese companies.
Okay.
In the case of the Clean Vehicle Credit 30D, there is a foreign entity of concern restriction that comes into effect this year and next. You can't qualify for that credit if there are minerals, extraction or processing or battery components that are from a foreign country of concern like China. But for the advanced manufacturing credit, that isn't true.
Okay, well, thank you, because that is one of my concerns of, these investments by Chinese-based companies and their subsidiaries. We're furthering our dependence on China. And it doesn't sound like there are any current restrictions under current law that would prevent a subsidiary of a Chinese company that receives IRA tax credits from sending those payments back to China. Is there any prohibition on that?
Well, they would help to defray the cost of production in the United States. This can't be production in China.
Right.
It has to be production in the United States.
But the
For
credits they
China,
could send back to, there's no prohibition on that.
there's no prohibition.
Okay, if there aren't any restrictions under current law, was there a reason not to propose any restrictions in the administration's budget proposal? And, you know, I've introduced the No-Goshen Act to stop these IRA tax credits from going to companies based in Iran, North Korea, Russia, and the CCP and their subsidiaries. Do you support that legislation?
Well, I don't want to, we haven't discussed that, and I don't want to I would need to study that and get back to you with I do think the legislation intended to shore up U.S. supply chains, to reduce our dependence on countries like China in areas like clean energy. That is an important reason for it, and I would think about it with that goal in mind.
Okay. Well, under Chinese law, a U.S. company that wants to send income back to the U.S. must obtain pre-approval for that transfer from Chinese tax authorities. Do you support incorporating similar pre-approval requirements or any other restrictions on Chinese firms sending IRA tax credit dollars back to China?
Well, I'm not going to take a position on that. Our general stance when it comes to foreign investment in the United States is we want to make sure that there are no national security concerns. We have a CFIUS process when it involves not greenfield investment, but buying out an American company or merging with it. And we would look at national security concerns. But in general, we welcome foreign investment in the United States. China does invest in the United States. And this particular provision that you're talking about in the IRA does not preclude China from receiving these credits. China would be producing in the United States, and in that sense, mitigating our dependence on foreign production.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Laurel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would just make one very quick comment about the earlier discussion about how many months it's taken us to get to having a budget for 2024. I think at the beginning of that, you can have all of the financial gymnastics you want. At the base of this is political will to get it done and understanding what needs to get done and what our responsibility is here in view of the American public, rather than adhering to ideologies that may satisfy one's soul but do nothing to help the American people. With that, Director Young, I want to ask you a question. This has to do with the WIC Contingency Fund, which is in the 2025 budget. This would allow an increase in WIC funding if the Secretary finds in any quarter that the program has exceeded statutorily specified participation and or food cost levels. Cost about $34 million, as I understand it. First, understand that I'm for the $7.7 billion for the program. This is not a substitute. It's an insurance policy. Just let me know. I know you work closely with USDA. Just quickly through the process of how we came to develop this solution. Is it a good solution?
Well, remember, the WIC estimates change constantly. It depends on uptake. It depends on economic conditions. So this contingency fund is an acknowledgement that those estimates change on a regular basis, in ensuring that we have a insurance policy, a backup plan. If you say, if the $7.7 billion turns out, my guess is by the time you pass this, that number is probably going to change. We want to ensure that we have full funding of WIC. We believe our $7.7 billion does that, but this contingency fund idea makes sure that the ebbs and flows of participation, that we have every tool to make sure we have enough money for full participation.
And just to note that there was $1 billion shortfall if that hadn't been met in the 24 budget, which we're hoping passing tomorrow, that in fact we would have seen millions of people waitlisted for that program. You know, about 2.2 million women, infants, and children jettisoned from a program that is life-saving. So thank you there. I just want to mention, this is the Council of Economic Advisors, a report on November 20th, the anti-poverty income-boosting impacts of the enhanced child tax credit. A highlight, it says, between 2021 2022, median post-tax real income among households with at least one child 17 or younger fell by $4,256, due in part to the reduction in the child tax credit. The household's median post-tax income would have been $2,600 higher in 2022 had they received the credit. 61% of the drop in median post-tax household income for families with children can be explained by this policy change. I don't have to tell you about what happened with the tax credit. You're all very, very familiar with that. But I would just say about Treasury, IRS accurately set 98% of monthly child tax credit payments, and that's commendable, I'd say. And additionally, the expanded child tax credit returns $8 for every dollar spent. Anybody who wants to answer, or maybe all of you very quickly, what would restoring that expanded child tax credit mean to families, in addition to lifting families out of poverty? What are the broader economic benefits of the child tax credit? Eric?
Thank you, Congresswoman. As you well know, and your fingerprints were very much on this development, the expansion of the child tax credit that the President signed into law helped to drive child poverty to a record low of 5.2%. Never in this country have we had such low child poverty, and scholars of poverty, child poverty will tell us how important that is, not just for year one, but for the rest of that child's life. When the CTC expired, that child poverty rate snapped back up. And the conclusion is that the level of the child poverty rate is very much a policy choice. This president in this budget, and this committee has worked with us on this, you in particular, proposes to restore the expanded child tax credit, thereby taking child poverty back down to levels I'd mentioned earlier, and fully paid for as well.
Thank you. With my 6 seconds, I will just say that the proposal that is in the United States Senate at the moment, I find to be lopsided in terms of what we provide to the richest corporations in the country versus what we do for children in our nation. Once again, it would be in keeping with what the president wants to do in looking at corporations rather than giving them the benefit of billions or millions in tax cuts, is that we work to invest in our families, in our children. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. DeLauro. I apologize for the distraction. It sounds to me, as an old broadcaster, it sounds to me like we got some RF interference in our sound system. So if you do your best to disregard that, there may be some kind of a transmitting device causing that. I'm not. We'll try to isolate that. Ms. Henson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of my top priorities in Congress is, of course, to advocate for the taxpayers in Iowa, the working families that we are all here to serve, and ensure that their tax dollars are being used responsibly to support Iowans' priorities. But unfortunately, we've seen a lot of improper payments continue to be a source of waste for federal taxpayer dollars. Actually, according to the report from Government Accountability Office, the federal government issued more than $236 billion in improper payments in fiscal year 2023. For context, that's more than the entire budget of the U.S. Army annually. And since 2021, the federal government has reported a staggering $764 billion in improper payments. So, Director Young, I know you're over there, but I just have a quick question for you. Has the administration taken a single step to ensure that these taxpayer dollars are being spent responsibly to prevent these improper payments before they occur? $236 billion is a lot of money.
Well, one, the ARP provided funds to the Department of Labor to begin the process of trying to improve the unemployment insurance program, which I think most people here will say that is one of the largest drivers of improper payments. This budget also has further proposals that would save $2 billion on UI. So we welcome, and we are starting to see some movement in some of the oversight agencies on moving on the budget proposal. It was in last year's budget as well, to do something about some of the higher improper payment programs of the federal government.
Are you looking at using technology like AI to help track these things before they actually happen? I think that would be ultimately the best outcome here is if we can stop them before they go out so we don't have to worry about trying to claw them back.
Well, that's one. You heard me earlier talking about the need to make sure the federal government stays ahead on technology. One thing we struggle with, frankly, and OMB is at the center at trying to figure out how to have proper AI talent across the federal government. And frankly, we don't have that right now, and we need to keep up with the technology to make sure we know how it impacts the American people, but also to utilize it for things like this. UI is difficult because you've seen one UI program, you've seen one. We have a federal overlay, but each state runs it how they want. So we are interested to see how we can utilize AI, but frankly, we at OMB are trying to deal with the AI talent deficit.
As a separate issue, though, from
As a separate issue,
claiming
but it is important. If we want to utilize these tools, we have to have the people that know how to do that. And part of our budget and part of what we're trying to do is ask for more talent there. But on UI, we're not leaning heavily into to AI, but we do have proposals to try to fix those programs.
I hope you'll commit to work with us, continuing that both on the talent side, but also on just the oversight side to prevent improper payments and make that a true top priority. That's a lot of money we're talking about. And want to go to one other topic really quick while I have time. FinCEN's new beneficial ownership reporting requirements went into effect earlier this year, requiring more than 32 million small business owners, including many in Iowa, to, of course, report information about their company to a new federal database, and the penalties for noncompliance on that can include both civil and criminal action. So I know our Secretary of State has posted on his page in Iowa, hey, this isn't a state issue, this is a federal issue. But for such a sweeping new rule, Secretary, it's very important that FinCEN is taking steps to really educate our small businesses on the impacts of this rule. So how are you ensuring that these 32 million new affected businesses are receiving the necessary resources to be able to comply?
So FinCEN has a well-thought-out and extensive education outreach program to make sure that businesses learn what their responsibility is, and they're trying to make it, and I've looked at the demonstrations of how this works. This is easy to file for the vast majority of businesses. It's not necessary to hire a lawyer or any help. It's a simple form on a website. There have been more than 1 million filings so far. It started on January 1, and there's a adequate time, I think, for businesses to comply.
And I see I'm rapidly approaching time, so I'll go ahead and yield back in the interest of letting everyone speak. Thank you.
Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Young, for being back in the room. It's nice to see you here. I want to invite your attention to Social Security as a subject. Today, the Republican Study Committee called for an increase in the Social Security retirement age, and so it's a timely subject. Right now, Social Security is projected to run out of excess reserves in about 10 years. I was pleased to see that the FY25 budget protects Social Security benefits and extends the solvency of Social Security. And so my first question is, how long will the provisions in the FY25 budget extend the solvency of the Social Security program?
Well, as you know, you've heard from the President what our principles on Social Security are. No benefit cuts, ensure that we have enough funding for those with disabilities who receive payments out of Social Security as high-income earners to pay more into the system, and you get additional years in solvency. We also point out something in direct control of this committee, which is Social Security Administration, who has been underfunded, and as beneficiaries go up and there are more people to serve, we are seeing a decline in resources at a time when Social Security Administration needs more. That is why this President's asking for a 9% increase to fund the Social Security Administration.
I just find it astonishing that today of all days, when you're here to talk about the FY25 budget, that the Republican Study Committee, the largest Republican caucus here in the House, comes out and calls for an increase in the Social Security retirement age. You know, that's one thing for people that have desk jobs, right? But for people that are lifting and digging and climbing and carrying, to expect them to work into their senior years doing these jobs, it's not just wrong, it's a betrayal. Because these are people who paid into the system, the FICA system, their whole work lives with an expectation that they would be taken care of in their senior years. And I'm glad to hear that you're not endorsing that. Let me ask you this. What more needs to be done to protect Social Security through the end of the century?
Well, you heard the president's plan. It is to ask those in the top 1 or 2% to pay more to deal with insolvency. The first thing we often go to are benefit cuts. Raising the age is a benefit cut. You worked all your life and the goalpost keeps moving. That is a benefit cut. And nothing gets more spirited when I testify on Social Security, and I've been asked many, many times, like, aren't you speaking in hyperbole, you and the president, that people want to cut it? And we see these proposals come out, and I get that every member is not a member, but it is a proposal to cut. And that is why this president finds it necessary to continue to remind the American people he will not sign any piece of legislation nor support benefit cuts to Social Security or Medicare.
Now, you alluded to the starving of the Social Security Administration for resources, and I want to talk about that. Unfortunately, they have been starved for decades, making it difficult for many of my constituents. I have 175,000 constituents receiving Social Security benefits in northeastern Pennsylvania. Makes it harder for them and people across the country to access their benefits when there aren't enough people working at Social Security. To make matters worse, budget constraints resulting from the FY24 CRs led to the Social Security Administration imposing a hiring freeze, which is still in effect today. Director Young, can you elaborate on what the consequences of a hiring freeze are at the Social Security Administration?
Well, we don't have enough people today to serve beneficiaries. So if we are not adding, certainly we will see people retire from the Social Security Administration. This means they won't be replaced. The problem is going to continue to grow. And then we're going to see people who don't believe their government is there to serve them. They know they're eligible for benefits. It should not take people that long to be able to get in contact, especially if they have a complicated case. But this is just going to get worse. We're happy we finally have a Social Security Administrator on the job. He is talking to contractors, making sure we're getting what the American people buy with their dollars from services. But there's only so much we can do when we have a chart of beneficiaries going this way and staffing and resources going the opposite way.
Well, I was happy to see a 9% funding increase on that line in your budget. And thank you for your testimony and thank you for your work. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. It is so true that Americans right now are living paycheck to paycheck, working to make things, make ends meet, and so much of that is due to the inflation that Americans have seen, in large part due to our massive spending. I hope Americans are listening to this hearing, because when we hear from our friends across the side of the aisle that we don't have a spending problem, that is just a notion that's beyond any sort of reality, because the fact is that we've had record revenues over the last several years up till very recently, and spending, no matter how much we're bringing in, continues to be a problem. And so we've got to address our spending issues and get things under control. One of the things that I was concerned about is there's a request for continued funding and expansion of the IRS to go after American taxpayers. Meanwhile, the IRS at the same time announced earlier this year that it's setting a goal for employees to be in the office just 50% of the time in May. So we're being asked to employ more federal workforce, and this is true across all the agencies. Anyone who does caseworks knows that anything from passports to VA benefits to farm help to helping people with Social Security benefits, that the timeline to get cases solved has massively expanded while the federal workforce continues to go, quote, to teleworking. And so the productivity is going down, but we're being asked to solve that by adding more people instead of finding ways to bring higher productivity. So I would encourage us to find ways to get people back to work. We're expecting the people who are funding the salaries of the IRS taxpayers to get people to work. And so I would recommend that we do that. You had a thought?
Well, you know, we're making sure that IRS, as well as all bureaus and Treasury departmental offices, meet the standards that have been set for the federal government, which is at least 50% time for everyone in the office. And many employees have to be there absolutely every day. And this applies absolutely to IRS employees in many parts of the IRS.
To the veterans that I'm working to try to get cases solved for them, 50% isn't enough to show up at work.
Well,
and literally speaking, one of the facilities was a literal work warehouse where the VA records are stored and have not been digitized. We funded them, I think it was to the tune of $60 million to digitize those records. They didn't do it because of COVID protocols. We tried to put in non-teleworking. You cannot telework when you have to literally walk through the aisles and look through file cabinets. And we couldn't even get teleprovisions passed by our friends on the left who opposed that provision. We've got to get people back to work so that we can solve these problems for the American people. I wanted to talk to you about a little bigger of an issue, and that is the strength of the U.S. dollar. You know, it's essentially important to the safety and security, freedom of the world, to have America have a strong influence. We've seen challenges against the U.S. dollar, a lot of it connected to our spending. I mean, as you know, we used to have a gold dollar, now we have a petrodollar that was based on, you know, an agreement really with Saudi Arabia to trade oil and gas using the American dollar. Very recently we've seen, and there's conflicting reports, but at a minimum, Saudi Arabia is considering joining BRICS, which has been built for the fundamental purpose of challenging the U.S. dollar. And I'm curious about your take on that. You know, this administration has an attack on the oil and gas industry in spite of that, and how that plays into monetary policy I'm very concerned about. But then also this administration and President Biden, when he was vice president, said, and this is a quote, "We are trying to create a multipolar world." In other words, we're trying to create a world where the United States is not the preeminent force. Now, most taxpayers would say that we should share the goal, regardless of where we are on the aisle, of United States remaining a premier influence in the world. So I would ask you, as you're addressing spending policy and these kind of things, do you share that goal of bringing the United States down a notch and us not being the premier influence in the
I
world?
do not share the goal of bringing the U.S. down a notch. I think it's essential that the U.S. Shows strong leadership throughout the global economy and leadership on the full range of challenges the world faces. I strongly believe the U.S. dollar needs to remain the world's primary reserve currency. And I see few challenges, real challenges to the U.S. dollar. It may be that there are BRICS countries that would love not to be dependent on the dollar, but none of those countries seem willing to accept any of those currencies as an alternative for doing business. And there's a very good reason for that. The U.S. is a well-managed country from a macro perspective. Inflation has for decades been low and stable. We have the deepest and most liquid capital markets in the world, and a rule of law and institutions that support the dollar's use as a reserve currency. Now, it is helpful when we want to impose sanctions on other countries. The dollar's role enables us to do that, because by using our sanctions tools to prevent malign actors from running transactions through the financial system.
I understand that, but I think
there's a
we would
desire.
be if we have a lot of strengths, but if we're not wary of the fact that historically speaking, when a currency collapses, it happens overnight, we've got to shore up our fiscal.
Need to move on. Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses. I'm going to yield 10 seconds to Mr. Hoyer, if it's all right, Mr. Chairman.
10 seconds. I just want to say to the gentleman's comment on confidence in the international markets, if we don't pass Ukraine funding forthwith, we're going to lose a lot of confidence in international markets and with our allies and our foes alike.
Great, thank you. Secretary Yellen, a question for you. The bonus tax credits that were created in the Inflation Reduction Act for clean energy projects require paying prevailing wages and utilizing registered apprentices, which are the most important labor standards in the IRA. I believe it's important that Treasury's final rule upholds congressional intent. As co-chair of the Congressional Labor Caucus, I sent a letter yesterday with over 100 of my colleagues outlining several key revisions to the proposed rule that we are urging Treasury to adopt, including treating project labor agreements as evidence of compliance and establishing a front-end monitoring system for employers that intend to claim the bonus credit for their clean energy projects. Our collective concern is that low-road contractors in the construction industry already try to evade federal prevailing wage laws and provide fly-by-night training to their workforce. Secretary Yellen, what steps is Treasury taking to set up robust enforcement of these labor standards to ensure projects pay prevailing wages and utilize registered apprentices? And will those steps include our suggestions around PLAs and front-end monitoring?
Well, let me say that we're working with the Department of Labor closely to respond on this issue and to provide some clarity and certainty on the requirements. I will say that when a taxpayer goes to claim that credit, that there will be rigorous procedures to make sure, given this is, in most cases, 80% of the total credit, so satisfying this is necessary to get most of the credit. There will be requirements when a firm is audited to provide books and records to show that every worker has received appropriate prevailing wages and the apprenticeship requirements have been met. I would say there is now an active market for tax credits. These credits are transferable, and you will also get a great deal of enforcement just through the market that is developing around these credits. Because if I'm contemplating buying a credit from a firm that in the end has not actually met these requirements, I will have spent money for a tax credit that I may well be denied, and there's an additional enforcement mechanism. We see that potential purchasers are asking for a good deal of assurance that these requirements are
We just
being
ask you to
met.
take a look at that letter, and we hope that you can incorporate those suggestions at any final rule. Also, I think this is something my colleague Ms. Hinson may also have some interest in. We support biofuels, the drive for economic growth and creating good-paying jobs and strengthening rural economies. The Inflation Reduction Act established a sustainable aviation fuel tax credit, and the final guidance for this credit was supposed to be released on March 1, but it's still not released. In December, the Treasury Department announced that the updated GREET model will be used as a methodology looking at integrating key greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies and climate-smart agricultural practices. As one of the co-chairs of the Biofuels Caucus, the President has been very clear that he wants to see our country lead the world in sustainable aviation fuel production. What's the status of that fuel credit guidance? And can you ensure that Treasury will include the greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies that were promised in the department's December announcement?
So we are working very closely with the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, the FAA, and the EPA. We want to get this GREET model updated so that it can handle some of the things that you've mentioned connected to sustainable aviation fuel. And this has extended our timeline for getting the guidance out, but we want to make sure that we do it right, and we're trying to get it out as quickly as we can.
And I think both Representative Hinson and my office are more than glad to work with you if you have any questions on
Certainly.
that.
Thank
you.
Mr. Carl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, on March the 6th, 2024, the House Judicial Committee released a report detailing the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, FinCEN, partnership with the FBI to gain access to consumers' information from major banks posted January 6, 2021. As a way of tracking and targeting individuals, it assumes could be domestic terrorists based on certain financial transactions they made, such as Dick's Sporting Goods or mobile payments that use keywords like MAGA. Are you familiar with this report?
I am familiar with the issue that you're just.
What actions are you taking to ensure that this FinCEN is not targeting conservative Americans for their constitutional rights or political beliefs?
Okay, so I'd like to put this in perspective if I could.
Very quickly, if you would, because I got a
Yes,
second question.
this is activity that took place before I reached Treasury.
Well, what are you doing today?
Under the previous administration, and it ended in February of 2021. In the aftermath of the attack on the Capitol, there was an attempt by law enforcement to identify perpetrators of the attack. FinCEN had been authorized by Congress to work with financial institutions in a process called FinCEN exchanges to help them identify. They're required to file suspicious activities reports.
Yes, ma'am, I get that.
And they
I'm-
wanted to get reports.
I'm asking you, what
would
are you
shed light
doing
on this.
today to prevent that from happening again?
This is a practice that has ended, and the
So you're doing
work
nothing
that
to
was
follow
done-
up on it?
There was no requirement for any bank to do anything. Banks met with some people from FinCEN to discuss how to
But this
search.
report that came out on March the 6th, you've not followed up on anything from it to see if there's something there that you need to do?
We are following up to make sure that there are no abuses.
Okay.
But it is our obligation to work with financial institutions to help them, help the government identify suspicious and illegal transactions.
Well, I can appreciate that, but innocent Americans, we don't need to be doing that on. And I understand where you're going with that. Director Young, the White House Chief of Staff requires agencies to submit action plans on OMB in January regarding their office spaces needed, but those haven't been made public, and the 2025 budget process doesn't appear to realize any significant savings from buildings, from building consolidation, either in D.C. or throughout the country. Why are we continuing spending over $10 billion annually on maintaining these buildings and securing leases for space that federal employees, when employees are being allowed to work hybrid schedules?
Well, thank you for acknowledging they work. This is about return to the office. Let me be very clear, just like the Secretary pointed out, there are thousands of federal employees who never got any opportunity to work hybrid in the thick of the pandemic and put their own health at risk. But you're right, OMB is central to, and we have put out guidance because we see the value. Just like you all do. You see people face to face. There is value in meaningful in-person work. But there has been telework pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. It's about mission. Different jobs have different requirements. I have some people at OMB who work in a SCIF. They've never gotten a chance to take advantage. So this is about mission. We think meaningful in-person presence, even for people who have office jobs that don't necessarily have to come into the office, like for SCIFs. So we're working and we're seeing improvements there.
But I'm running out of time here. My question is the $10 billion annually we're paying. We see no reductions with this staff, this group not coming back. With that said, will you commit that the OMB will lead this effort so we can consolidate under utilizing office space?
Mr. Carl, you, the chairman, Mr. Hoyer, I think we all have an interest. And I've talked to the chairman a lot about this, and she's doing something about space utilization, which frankly was a problem when I worked on this subcommittee more than 10 years ago. And we need the tools to make sure GSA can consolidate and manage as the manager of the federal portfolio. There are lots of challenges here pre-pandemic that remain, and I'm committed to working with you and anyone else who's interested.
Thank you.
Because we need the tools to fix it.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions, one for Director Young and one for Secretary Yellen. The first is for Director Young. Medical debt and increasing healthcare costs are a real problem in the country, especially its disparate impact on minority communities. For Americans with annual income in the $50,000 to $100,000 range, Black and Hispanic families have the highest rates of medical debt. And there are products in the market now that seek to help consumers pay for unexpected medical expenses that are not covered by their ACA-qualified health plan. And I'm concerned about a regulation that is currently under review at OMB that you and I have spoken about before. In particular, I'm referring to the changes that will be imposed on the fixed indemnity insurance market under a tri-agency proposed rule that was issued last summer. Overall, if the rule were finalized as it is, it would do more harm than good for millions of Americans. There's universal agreement that consumers should be protected from sham insurance products, and they should not be misled into believing that they're purchasing ACA-compliant plans. However, there are existing mechanisms that address these concerns without eliminating valuable financial protection that's available today through the supplemental or the fixed indemnity coverage. In fact, the FTC just recently announced a $100 million enforcement action against a company that was selling sham health insurance products. And this is sort of proof positive that the administration has existing enforcement tools to protect consumers. In fact, the FTC is just one of the many tools available. And I know that you can't comment substantively on a rule that's under review at OMB, but can you tell me whether the administration did an impact analysis, and specifically one for historically marginalized communities, on what their alternatives are to pay for expenses the underlying major medical coverage does not?
Mr. Bishop, I believe people interested in this are going through public comment now. You're right, I can't comment once it's in review. And your comments and those concerned, I know, have been recorded in the comment purposes. In order to even get to OMB and to OIRA, which is the regulatory office at OMB, a rule has to be seen or have analysis that shows it has a large, a certain dollar amount economic impact. So every rule has to have that sort of analysis that you're speaking about. That's how we know whether or not it has to come in for review. And we believe that process upholds the integrity of the process. It allows large rules to get the comments from the public and other agencies to make sure that we're catching all the issues you pointed out, I'm sure have come through the comment process.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, according to IRS in 2021, the government collected only 86% of the total taxes that it was legally owed, leaving about $625 billion uncollected. Between 2001 and 2021, the tax gap has consistently ranged between 13 and 16% total owed taxes. Why is the tax gap so persistent, and how does your budget seek to address the tax gap and to keep IRS funded at a sustainable level, which enforces the laws that are already on the books? And where does the tax gap tend to come from? Are there certain kinds of taxes or certain categories of taxpayers that contribute more to the tax gap than others? and tell me if it's true that 10% of the earners are responsible for 2/3 of the unpaid taxes. In the Inflation Reduction Act, we included $80 billion in additional funding to IRS to narrow the tax gap, but also to improve customer service. Some of my colleagues want to repeal that funding, but the CBO tells us that it saves more than it costs. How much additional revenue can be gained for every dollar that's invested in IRS?
Well, prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS was literally starved for resources, and the auditing rates on complex partnerships, corporations, and high-income tax filers dropped to exceptionally low levels. And the funding provided by the IRA is intended and is beginning to really change that and help us address the tax gap. There are various estimates of the rate of return on this spending, but a simple one is that for every dollar spent, $7 in tax revenue is generated. So there's, and some estimates are higher than that. Where does it come from? Well, individuals who have simple tax returns, who get almost all of their income through W-2s, that income is reported to the IRS, and when the IRS has reporting, the fraction that is reported on tax returns comes close to 100%. So there is no tax gap relating to W-2 income at all. But when income isn't reported, an example would be rents and royalties. It's estimated that, so the IRS has no independent information. It relies on the honesty of taxpayers and audits. The reporting rate has dropped to something like 55%. So really, at the end of the day, it's complex partnerships, it's high income and net worth individuals who are, and the lack of auditing and resources at the IRS. They're beginning to use tools like artificial intelligence to identify taxpayers who are more likely to be deficient in their tax filings.
Have to move along. Have to move along. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the entire panel, thanks so much for being with us this afternoon. Secretary Yellen, the President's budget proposes increasing the corporate tax rate to 28%, one of the highest in the world. This tax hike would undoubtedly put America at an economic disadvantage to global competitors like China. And even though it's touted as a tax increase on the rich, it is widely believed that as much as 75% of the burden of corporate tax increases fall on American workers and consumers in the form of lower wages and higher prices. So I'm just curious, exactly who would this tax increase be good for?
Well, I believe the tax increase would not really harm the competitiveness of business. Most studies that have been done suggest that there is very little, if any, economic benefit from having cut the corporate tax rate, that almost all of the gains went to the wealthiest taxpayers. And it's deprived us of the revenues we need to deal with our budget deficit. It's probably lowered TCJA, probably lowered revenues as a share of GDP by something close to 1%. So it partly explains the deficit. The kind of program that I think is good for American growth is this sort of legislation that President Biden has championed and has been passed by Congress, much of it on a bipartisan basis, making investments
And thank you, because I'm going to run out of time here, and I've got a couple more questions I'd like to move on respectfully. And so I think we have a philosophical difference on exactly who is the rich. I'm referring to a corporate tax rate increase that's in the budget. A corporation is not a rich individual. A corporation is a band or a group of individuals and entities that have invested their money in order to produce jobs, buy equipment, and that sort of thing. And so if we're talking about Bill Gates, maybe we could say, here's a rich person and maybe he should pay more taxes. But when we're talking about a corporate tax entity, I very much believe that we are placing American workers at risk by not being as competitive worldwide. And so can you reconcile the difference between a rich person and a corporation?
Well, it depends what the corporate ownership is, but stock holdings are concentrated among relatively wealthy people and disproportionately among foreigners rather than Americans.
Yeah,
so when we use the proceeds...
And again, respectfully, because I'm going to run out of time. If we had more time, I'd love to hear the whole answer there. And so, again, respectfully, I would disagree with that statement because we're not all rich. A lot of people put a few $100s in the stock market and own a few corporations. And it seems to me like a tax, an additional tax, would be very counterproductive.
Well, I think you have to remember that with the revenue that we get from those taxes, we're able to do things like propose a larger child tax credit, which really goes to families and disadvantaged, and do other things that are immensely helpful to working Americans.
Again, it's a philosophical difference. We're not going to shake out here. Mr. Chair, I'm not going to have time for another question, so I'll yield.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Ms. Ming.
Miss Ming is my twin from New York. It's okay.
I'm so sorry.
Director Young, I want to take this opportunity to also acknowledge and join my colleague on the other side of the aisle in saying that I really appreciate how much federal workers work, how hard they work, especially the people that work for you, and your effort in helping me address this longstanding issue with 911 dispatchers. I don't necessarily have a question for you. I just want to acknowledge how much work you have done in helping to educate yourself and your staff on the plight of these primarily female workers that have not been recognized for the work that they do. So thank you so much for that. Secretary Yellen, I have two very different issues that I want to work with you on, and one of them deals with fire insurance, specifically for California. The other issue is related to the work that I do internationally. I want to also take a moment to thank you and the Treasury Department employees for your pivotal work on sanctions around the world. As you're aware, I'm deeply concerned about the future of democracy and the rule of law in the Northern Triangle, particularly how it impacts our southern border region. During an attempted coup last year, corrupt actors sought to stop the peaceful transfer of power of the president of Guatemala. The Treasury Department's sanctions on corrupt actors played a vital role in our commitment to supporting the people in that country and not propping up corrupt actors and wannabe dictators. Sanctions are key to fighting MS-13, the Mexican mafia, and other criminal networks that stretch into many of our backyards. And that's not even going into, other countries, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and many other places. Can you share with us a little bit more about what your fiscal year 25 budget request and the emergency supplemental funding would accomplish for our national security? And what more can we do to help you staff up the positions that you need in order to further the work that our State Department is doing?
Thanks. Well, we take our sanctions responsibility very seriously. We have a large number, can't remember the exact number, but more than 40 sanctions programs. And over the last several years, the amount of time and effort we've put into sanctions has really skyrocketed, partly because we're now so focused on Hamas and trying to cut off flows of resources to Hamas, and also because of the Russian situation with respect to Ukraine. So these are areas of special emphasis that we've worked globally with partners, and I won't go into the full range of
Yes, and I will
programs,
have an additional question that I would send your way regarding Hamas's work in Latin America. So if I can move over to the issue of insurance,
Yes.
Specifically for California. There is no help to alleviate the crisis. My constituents have seen their fire insurance balloon from $1,800 to almost $6,000 per year. This is not sustainable. Non-renewals of home and fire insurance policies climbed from 11% in 2018 to 13% in 2021. Most of the top insurance in the state have either stopped writing or restricted new policies. How can the federal insurance office work with states like California, Florida, and other states to help find solutions to the cost of insurance?
We're very concerned about this for exactly the reasons you've given. The Federal Insurance Office has now agreed to collaborate with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners to undertake a very detailed collection effort to understand exactly what is happening to the availability and cost of insurance against environmental hazards across the country. Almost all of the states are participating in this. And when we have that information, we'll try to come up with some recommendations. But I would point out this is an area where states have traditionally taken the lead, and we're going to have to figure out what we can do working together and with the states to try to address
We're going to have to push them
what's
to do
becoming
more for the
a real
consumers.
crisis.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Norma. I am so sorry. I should have been paying better attention. Won't happen again, ma'am. It's on me. Mr. Joyce, bring us home.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here today. Secretary Yellen, I want to discuss with you an issue that I've been working on for a number of years. 5 years ago, I brought up the same issue with your predecessor, Secretary Mnuchin, during the same budget hearing. He previously referred to the status quo as untenable during the hearing on talking about access for cannabis banking to the cannabis industry, the banking. The discrepancy between federal and state cannabis laws have created conflict in the department's ability to administer that many areas under its jurisdiction. And as a former prosecutor, I shared his concern about the business having to deal with these huge amounts of cash and not being able to put it in depository institutions for public safety reasons. Can you tell me what is presently this administration's position on safe banking?
I think we would potentially welcome legislation in this area that would clarify for banks what their responsibilities are. At present, my understanding is that there's a conflict between federal law outlawing marijuana sales and many state laws. And while I believe that there's not active prosecutions, banking organizations do feel compelled to be in accord with laws, and the fact that marijuana is outlawed by the federal government creates an impediment to their willingness to provide banking services to cannabis firms, and it creates all the problems that you're familiar with. And so I think legislation may be necessary to raise the comfort level that banks have with doing this business.
Mr. Joyce, will you yield a second?
I
Just a
would
second.
always.
You're very kind. I agree with Mr. Joyce 100%. It is a shame that the Senate has not passed legislation that we passed in the House. We're putting people in a very vulnerable position where they have large amounts of cash. We are encouraging criminals to break into businesses that deal in cannabis. I am neither a user nor a suggester of using, but the fact of the matter is every state that's voted on it has made it legal, every state. And I appreciate your work, and whatever I can do to help you, I'm there.
Thank you very much, sir. So is it fair to say that you share Secretary Mnuchin's concerns and agree that the situation is untenable as it presently exists?
I think it's a real problem, and that it would be desirable to have legislation that alleviated this problem.
Thank you very much. It would be remiss if I did not address Director Young and say I really liked you more when you were on our team.
I'm still on your team.
Yeah, one of my other top priorities here is addressing the opioid crisis and the problems that we've had with fentanyl. And as chairman of the Homeland Security Appropriations Committee, the southern border obviously is a grave concern for all of us regarding fentanyl. Director Young, how does the president's FY25 budget request address the fentanyl crisis and seek to change this reality? And is there some type of whole of government approach that this administration is working to pursue?
Mr. Joyce, I got this question from a Democrat this morning in House Budget, from you here. It's one of the places that gets lost in rhetoric of the year on border. When I was here, this is one of the places where there's agreement, and I hope we can find a way to enact the parts of the president's supplemental, certainly that do deal with fentanyl. And this budget repeats those asks, $1.2 billion for DHS to stop fentanyl from entering the country. You know the NIA equipment, everyone says it works. We bought a bunch years ago. We don't have money to outfit the land ports of entry to put all of those in. We also need more equipment to put in more land ports of entry. So we have a technology that works that's not been fully implemented and utilized. And we'd love to work with anybody to help get that done.
With all due respect, something that killed this many kids in our country, and not just kids, adults as well, we should declare war on. I yield back.
Thank you. Great hearing. To our panelists, thank you so much. Madam Secretary, always an honor to have you here. Director Young, same to you. Chairman Bernstein, thanks again for your work as well and for being here today. I want to remind members, if you have questions to submit for the record, please do so within 7 days. In closing, again, let me thank everyone for being here, and we look forward to working with all of you as we continue the FY25 FSGG appropriations process. With that, this hearing stands adjourned. No, you're good. You're good.